but I'd like to just find out what you guys need or want to know specifically.
I've got some questions that people emailed about, so maybe do these ones first.
Well, let's go back and forth. Let's do one that you have and then one from somebody here.
All right.
So what do you have?
And for the recording, everyone talking to this microphone, just for YouTube later.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Do you approach tuning differently based on snare drum materials like metal versus wood?
Oh, that's a really good question. Thanks. I totally forgot about that. Yes. It's interesting. I prefer a wood drum generally. I just like the character that a wood shell brings. However, I am probably the world's biggest fibes fan because I love the fiberglass shells. They're very, very sensitive. They project really well, and they actually have a warmth and a character to them that I really like. Metal shells, I don't tune the drum any differently necessarily, in that I still tune the same between the top and the bottom. But metal drums, it depends on the material. Is it brass? Is it copper? Is it bronze? Is it steel? I personally don't care much for the steel drums because they have a tendency to just be harsh and just cutting. Brass will have a nice warmth and character to it, copper especially so. If you think about the metals, steel is steel. It's going to be harsh and it's going to be bright and cutting. Brass is going to have some nice warmth to it, like the old 20-0 Ludwig drums. Think of that. Bronze sits in the middle between brass and copper, so it's a little bit warmer than brass, not so much as copper. And then copper is actually a really nice material for snares. It has a nice warm character to it. I don't tune them necessarily any differently. It's more a situation of what drum would I use based on what situation I'm playing in. If I was playing somewhere where I felt I really needed more cut to it than I would get from the wood snare, then I'd probably bring out the fibes or maybe bring out a brass shell. So it'd be more like that.
All right, cool. Anybody have any questions out in the audience?
Here?
Don't be shy.
Yeah.
All right, you were first.
Yeah.
Oh, I get the mic?
Well,
Well, we want to capture it for the video so we hear everybody's.
My question is, how do you have any specific way of tuning for snare beds, like snare beds that are more narrow or shallow or deeper? When you talk about tuning by hand or by feel, can you explain that, please?
That's a great question. That's a fabulous question. It's less of an issue on modern drums. It's a pain in the rear end on vintage drums. You get some of those old vintage drums, man, and the snare bed looks like, it looks like a smiley face. It's just like, man, I don't know what they were thinking. The best example of that is the old Gretsch snares from the 60s, 50s and 60s. The 5.5 by 14s, and God forbid you should have a 4 by 14. It's the coolest looking drum and the worst playing drum in the world. But on those, yes, it is a weird animal because on a modern drum, generally speaking, that bottom, you can tune turning the bottom. If it turned at one turn per rod, fine. On some of the old vintage drums, sometimes what you got to do, if they've got these really weird, when they talk about the snare bed, you're talking about where the wires sit here. And there has to be some sort of a bed for the wires. This is the wrong drum to use for the example. For the wires to lay flat, there has to be some sort of a bed in the area where the wires come down. So on the old vintage stuff, some of these beds are very, very deep. And if you start tuning the bottom head, you're going to see here, and here, literally what looks like wrinkles. And so then you try to compensate for it. Well, let me try, and it's really, sometimes really hard to. So with some of the older drums, what I've found is, and again, it varies by drum, and also depends too on the strainer. But where it's a really wide bed, sometimes I just tune the drum the normal way that I would tune it, test it out, see what's going on. If it sounds too choked, what I'll do sometimes is just take these two and loosen them a little bit so that it creates a little bit more vibration in that channel that the snare wires sit on. So I'll try that. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes they're just not good. You know, and sometimes what'll happen is guys will take those drums where Slingerland Radio Kings were great drums. The Radio Kings with what they called a clamshell strainer, it's the worst strainer that was ever invented, ever. And it was such a horrendous design that maybe 9 out of 10 of the drums never sound good. Guys end up having to recut the bearing edges because the strainer just did not engage properly. It's poor design. So sometimes a bad drum, sometimes it's just best to get rid of it. If it's too much work, get rid of it. Or if you really love it for personal reasons, then go get the beds cut so that it's actually usable too. So that's one of the things on some of those. The beds are kind of weird. The Gretsch drums from the 50s are terrible in that regard. Again, it's if you go back, go look in the Gretsch book that Chet Falzarano wrote, and the guys who are still alive who did interviews would talk about how they loved the toms and bass drums so much that they lived with the snare drums, but the snare drums were horrible to tune. Part of it was the microsensitive strainer, which is, here we go. This is the new version that actually works. But the old one looked kind of like this. And it had a funky little mechanism in here that would break a lot. But when I said the 4x14s are the worst in the world, this strainer was never meant to be on a shell that shallow. So on a 4x14, the Gretsch Progressive Jazz, on the 4x14, the problem becomes the snare wires almost never disengage fully. So when you throw the strainer off and hit the drum, you should get a tom sound, but you don't. You get snare vibration. So you know, that was taken away when this was redesigned about 8 years ago. But those old originals are difficult. Another thing, when you think about tuning, just for a quick second, most of us have snare drums that have a tuning mechanism, a strainer mechanism with a knob on one side. But you do have some of those, like this is an example, where you've got the mechanism on both sides. You've got a knob here on the butt side, and you've got a knob on the strainer side. When you have a drum like that, it's especially important that you got the snares laying properly, because you don't want the snares, well, first of all, when you disengage the wires, it's really hard to see. When you disengage the wires, you want them to be laying off the shell and so that they look even. Not, so I'm going to overly exaggerate it. If you got a situation where when you disengage the wires, where the tab is that holds the wires should be like this. If it's like this, then you're always going to have some issue, because when you engage the snares, if it's cockeyed, some of them are going to be tighter, the others are going to be looser. They're never going to tension upright. If you do too much, you'll still hear some buzz. Others will sound choked, so you got to get it level. And the biggest pain in the rear end in tuning a snare drum has nothing to do with tuning the top and bottom. It's getting the snare wires straight on the bottom. Biggest pain in the rear end I have ever experienced to this day. I still hate doing it. I actually make him do it. I hate it with a passion. But all that being said, if you've got a knob, a strainer knob on both sides, then you have to keep in your mind, what are you doing here? Because if you start to crank it up over this side, but you don't do some sort of corresponding change over here, then you don't have even tension. So in the real sense, the knob on both sides is kind of unnecessary, especially if you just have a regular strainer mechanism. Drums like the old Ludwig super sensitives, where the mechanism goes parallel release and it goes all the way across the bottom, that had two knobs. It had a knob on a little wheel on each side. And that was also another one of the worst mechanisms in the world to try to tune. And guys would play Superphonic 400s, right? 10-lug drum with a plain old regular strainer, Steve Gadd, right? Well, but the super sensitive is so much better. The super sensitive is a pain in the rear end to tune. Al Duffy, who worked at the professional percussion shop, Frank Ippolito's Pro Percussion in New York. We used to talk about that. This is in the early 70s. It's a horrible mechanism, because it's so finicky that those little wheels, as you're playing, the wheels start to turn on their own. They don't lock down. Plus, if you want to adjust it, if you adjust on one side, you've got to adjust on the other side, and worse yet, one side was to tighten it went in this direction, the other side to tighten it went in that direction. And everybody finally said, I'm done. I'm not going to deal with it. And that was the same thing that was true, although this was a much better mechanism, the Rogers Dynasonic. It was the same thing. Guys would say, I don't want to spend the time figuring out how to deal with this. So they wouldn't buy the Dynasonic, they'd buy the Powertone, which was a 10-lug version with a simple throw-off and regular wires, because it was easier for them to tune, just like the Supraphonic 400 aluminum snare was easier to tune than the Super Sensitives. And for guys like Gad, you're going in the studio, you have no time to mess around. You want it dialed in, you want it to be the same all the time, and not worry about, oh, the thumb wheel moved over here and over there, and nobody has time for that. So I hope, does that answer? Was that? Okay. Okay. What else we got?
All right, so touch on the intricacies of Gladstone tuning and the Gladstone system.
Oh, wow.
That was a request.
Okay. I'll talk about that. I won't spend a huge amount of time on it because it's not going to come up very often. Could you, in my office, can you run and get the Gladstone?
Sure. I guess
It's next to my chair on the floor, the maple drum.
Sure.
This is actually pretty interesting. Billy Gladstone, Radio City Music Hall, world-class percussionist and inventor. Who knows about Gladstone? Okay. Yes? Okay. Billy was sick beyond belief as a player, just ridiculous, and played at Radio City Music Hall and he was an inventor, so he invented a method for tuning mechanism. He invented several things. Thank you, bud. Okay. One thing he invented was this throw-off, which doesn't look like any big deal to you, but it's just, hey, off, on, and a knob. Okay, great. This, you can't see it really well, tone control. Remember that, the round tone control knob we talked about. This was Billy's version, and on this particular drum, there's the two pads up here that come up against the head, but there's this little thing over here with numbers on it. And his idea was playing Radio City Music Hall. So for the shows, at a certain passage in the music, you need the snare to be muffled a little bit. So on that passage, 5. He knew he'd just pull the muffler up to 5, and it was enough muffling for that passage, and then he'd crank it back down again. So that was his idea. But the most important idea that he had was tuning. And this doesn't look like any big deal at the moment right here. But it's a tube lug, okay? The difference is, this is what's called three-way tuning. And he developed this off the principles of a skate key, and don't ask me how, I have no clue. But he developed this mechanism so that you can tune the drum from the top. You can tune everything from the top. You can tune the bottom head from the top, you can tune the top head from the top, and tune both together. And the way he did it was very cool. So, there's a key. It's a three-way key. And the reason this is worth talking about a little bit is because Arnie Lang of Lang Percussion in New York makes replicas of these drums and has done that for about 25 years. He still has his original Gladstone drum. We now make those replicas with Crabby Shell solid shells, and they are pretty insane. But here's what happens here. This key has 3 slots on it. One of them is just like a regular drum key. And if you could see close enough, this mechanism has a piece here that's just like a regular drum key. Okay? When you turn that one, it's tightening the bottom head. So there's kind of a reverse thread thing going on, so that when you tune on that square knob up here, it tightens the bottom head. Okay. Right here, next to it, is a hexagonal nut. Another part of the key locks onto the hexagonal nut. When you tighten that, it tightens the top head. And the cool piece is the third part of the key is designed with a cutout that's a hex and a square. And that locks down on both together and tunes the whole drum. And the reason he did this is kind of cool. The reason he invented this, Radio City Music Hall had 3 basements. So there was a basement, the sub-basement, a sub, and a sub-sub. It was ridiculous. And when they would bring the stage up from the basement, by the time they got from the sub-sub basement to the stage level, the humidity had changed and they had calf heads. We're talking about the 40s now. no plastic heads. So he had to tune the drum on stage. His take was, it's very unprofessional to sit there, take the drum off the stand, flip it over, and do all this jazz. So he invented this so he would never have to take the drum off the stand when he got up to the stage level, which was very cool. Hang on, I lost my microphone again. Oh, find the clip. There we go. Nope, that's not the clip. All right. Well, we'll punt without it for a minute. I'll hold it up. So, that was the concept that he developed. Literally three ways to tune the drum. The top head from the top, the bottom head from the top, and both together. And if you think about it in a studio environment, think about it today. If you've got the heads the way you want them between the top and the bottom, okay? But you're in the studio. And somebody says, okay, that's great, that's a great cut. Now we're gonna do this next cut. And can you get that Al Green kind of a snare drum sound? Well, then you gotta go run and grab another drum, right? No, you don't. You lock on the top and the bottom and just crank the whole thing down. It'll still keep the same amount of tension between the top and the bottom, but it'll move the pitch all the way down or all the way up, depending on how you want to look at it. Oh, all right. Well, I'll get back to normal here. Hang on. 2 seconds. We got to find a better thing than this clip, but we'll figure it out. I know. So that's the story on these. Billy first designed these drums in the 30s, and he used, they were made by Gretsch, and they were called Gretsch Gladstone. And they were 3-ply Gretsch shells. Then after the war, he decided to make these on his own. And he went to, the Gretsch Gladstones had a single node for the lug, these have a double node. And then Billy made about 51 drums or so, thereabouts, in his lifetime. And there's maybe about 25 of these exist. And they are actually the most prized and most expensive snare drums. Orchestral players love these things. I've sold 10 of the 25 existing examples. And I mean, this stuff, what you'd call a common one, if you can call any of them common, black lacquer with chrome hardware, not owned by anybody famous, is about an $18,000 drum. The most expensive one I ever sold was one of 4 Bird's Eye maple with gold hardware. And I owned one of those and sold it. The one I sold for a customer was literally pristine, and that was about a $27,000 drum. And the quick story on Gladstone, and Bud, would you put that back, because this one is, I should quickly, this is an original, but it's an undocumented original. It's kind of a weird, funky drum. The nameplate on here says, custom built for Pete Spoomer. And I have no idea who Pete Spoomer is. S-P-O-M-E-R. No guys I know have any clue who Pete Spoomer is. But hey, he might have been a businessman, had a lot of money, said, I want a drum. And when we got it years and years ago, it was missing a few parts. So some of the parts on here are Arnie Lang's replacement parts. So this one is not 100% original as Billy built it, but it's still about a $16,000 drum. There was one kit. Billy also made 4 drum sets. And the drum sets were just standard tuning. Just had regular lugs, standard tuning. But he only made 4 sets. And one set was destroyed in a fire. One set, the bass drum was destroyed in a flood. So there were 2 proper sets left. My friend in Italy, Chet Falzerano, has one of those. He also has about 5 Gladstones, and he's an expert on Gladstones. And the other set was a set that was made for Maury Feld, for Benny Goodman. And Maury Feld played it when he was with Goodman, 13, 16, 22, White Marine Pearl, and the snare drum with it was Cozy Coles. And that set made the rounds from Charlie Donnelly in Newington, Connecticut, to Bunny Carlos, to my friend Carl Palmer in England from ELP. And a few years ago, I sold it for Carl to Charlie Watts. And it's so it's over in London in Charlie's collection. But anyway, that's the Gladstone story.
Cool. I think I saw a question over here.
Yes.
Right? Oh, I knew it was in that direction.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sympathetic vibration. A lot of times when I will hit one of my tom-toms, the snares will ring. curiously enough, I have 2 snare drums, a metal shell Sonar, and I have a TDR Slingerland that I actually bought from you, with a set where the snares go all the way across and
Yep.
beyond the drum. I never have that problem with those, but I would like to get some idea on how to fix it with all the other ones I use.
Yeah, that's a funny thing, and I'm not sure I have a really good answer for it, because I'll experience that once in a while. Sometimes it depends on a mixture of things. What snare is it? What tom? Like, for example, it's not always every snare that you bring. You can have that same tom, but it doesn't do it with your TDR maybe, but it does it with something else.
Yes.
And sometimes I think it's just got to do with the pitch that's coming out of that tom, that vibration that's coming out of there is just causing enough of a vibration in this drum. Maybe this drum, if it's an old vintage one, and it's a thinner shell, and it's a little bit more susceptible to reacting to it. It's a weird thing. I don't have a really good answer of how to get rid of that. Generally speaking, in the course of the music, things like that aren't an issue, because like we said before, with vibration, with snare overtones, you hear it there, but in the middle of a tune, you don't hear those overtones, you hear the stroke. But I don't have a really good answer for that one. I think it just really depends on what drum you're using with what kit. I mean, have you tried things like, if you have that same drum and you put like a gel dot, or just put your wallet or put a handkerchief on there, does it still do it?
I usually use a ring, a Mylar ring.
Yeah, those little. Yeah, and does it still do it with that?
Well, yeah, because it's the snare that's vibrating, not.
Yeah, so it's.
And like I say, it's funny because with those 2 particular drums, I don't get it.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a funny thing. I've seen that on a few things. I have not seen it with anything modern era. I've seen it when I've had that be a problem. It's usually it's a vintage era snare, and for whatever reason, that one just has some issues. When you tighten the wires, does it still do it, even if the wires are tighter?
Well, I like the wires to be a little looser.
Well, yeah,
because
I know.
The kind of music I play.
Yeah, because you want to have the sound to be the sound you want from the drum.
Right.
Yeah, you don't want to have to just. Yeah, I think that kind of falls into the realm of, don't use that snare drum with that kit.
I'm beginning to come to that conclusion.
I was going to say.
I thought I'd take one stab at it here.
Yeah, I think sometimes that's.
I was going to say turn the snares off. That's it. Turn the snares
Well,
off. That's it.
yeah.
But like if you're playing brushes.
Yeah, if
then
you're playing
turn the snares
brushes,
off.
you would want to turn the wires off.
Do you play brushes with snares on or off?
Depends on the song. Mostly snares on, but I am playing with.
Yeah.
Almost everyone
Snares off.
plays brushes with snares on, and I've always found Rich Thompson told me to play them with snares off.
Yeah.
That's one thing that
I am a horrible brush player, and I'll be the first one to admit that. That's for sure. And I used to always play them with the snares on. But if you listen to a lot of records, you listen to Roy Haynes playing on some things, and I go, oh yeah, he's playing with the snares. And a lot of guys play with the snares off, and it makes perfect sense, because especially it's a ballad. It's a really quiet ballad, so you don't want to stomp all over the nice delicate piano solo with bzzz. I mean, makes perfect sense. Throw the wires off and just.
Because yeah, me personally, like if you're doing a recording, the only time I've ever heard the snares where it actually really bothered me was like in a ballad. That's the only time because so just for recording at least, that might be an idea.
On a ballad, you'd pull them
off.
But Davy Tuff could take the Woody Herman band out, and Papa Joe could take the Basie band out through the shout chorus with brushes with the snares on. Of course, because then you want to hear that, but. Sure. That's a different animal. That's the shout chorus, not the middle of a piano trio ballad, or even worse yet, with a vocalist that doesn't want to listen to the distractions. They want that purity of their voice.
As a matter of fact, a lot of the times that I play brushes with the snares off is behind a vocalist.
Absolutely, yeah. You want the least, and most of the vocalists, the jazz vocalists, don't bring that cymbal with the rivets. Yeah. they don't want to hear it. All right. All right, what else?
We could do
Question-wise.
another.
Let me see how we're doing here.
Hold on just a second. All right. So, another question. This person was just interested in talking about the batter head. Like, what's your procedure when you're thinking of the batter head? And just just kind of if you could step through any. I guess you've done a little bit of that, but maybe just focus only on the batter head. Like, if you're taking a drum from scratch, just tuning the batter head. What's your procedure?
Okay. Well, yeah, because we did kind of talk about that. It's really no different. I have a drum.
The detuned one.
Let's take the detuned drum just for the hell of it. Right here. Oh, yeah, the pop filter. All right. We'll go through.
Yeah, maybe just walk it through.
Technology stuff figured out eventually.
Sounds great.
All right, here you go. There's a beauty for you. All right. This is a Crabby solid shell. It's actually a solid poplar shell that I had my guys in New York build out as a Maxwell drum. But I detuned it on purpose just so we could do something. So when I do this, we'll just walk through it. And I do this so that it's finger tight.
We're gonna do the whole drum, both sides. So
Yeah, I'll do the
we'll
whole
do the batter and the
So
resonant on
we'll
this
cover
one.
both. Okay. So when somebody says, okay, so I'll go, all right, so I've tuned this down so it's kind of finger tight, so you've got it down snug. So I'll do my one full turn over there, and I usually just do them across. Go straight across. Do whatever you want, but this one's finger tight, so let's do the one there. But before I tune the next one, make each one finger tight again, okay? Because when you tune this, that's going to be a little bit looser. So we'll do our one there. Back across over here, finger tight that one again. Over here. Where it first engages. There. 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 And okay. Boring to watch, but there it is. Okay. Same thing on the top. Now we got nice tom tom. Finger tight here. That one. That one. And starting with the Crabby shell is not a bad way to start either, though. I used to tell people, if you can't tune a Crabby snare drum, then stop playing. You almost can't get it wrong. Well, this one wasn't loose. Okay.
That's why they're started at $1,000 each, right?
Well, yeah.
Whatever it is. Well, guitars.
Okay, so where are we at? Okay, so I took that about the same as the bottom. I'm just going to do a little extra tweak on the top. And again, I tune a little higher, so got to loosen these up a little bit. Okay, so. Yeah, a little bit low. Bring up the wires a little more. And just for my own liking, I might take this up a little bit more. But I mean, in terms of the top head, just play around with it till it sounds the way you like it, you know. And if you start to get too much tighter on top, then you want to take a little bit of a corresponding uptick on the bottom. When I think about it, maybe it's 25% tighter on the top than it is on the bottom, ballpark. So if you really start cranking the top, you want to at some point do something on the bottom as well. So let me see how we are here. Yeah, and you can play around with it. This one, shell material is another thing too. This drum is not a maple shell. This is a poplar shell. So it's not going to have the same brightness that maple will. It's going to have a little bit, and you can hear it in this drum. It has a little bit more warmth and body to it, and that's by nature of the wood. When you talk about it makes a difference when it's a solid shell drum. It makes less of a difference with plywood. Because, I mean, plywood is going to be obviously thin plies formed together, but on a solid steam bent board, there is going to be a difference sonically between the woods. So woods like maple and cherry will be brighter. Ash will be brighter but have a little longer sustain. Walnut falls in the middle. It's a little bit warmer. Mahogany is going to be really warm. And by the same token, so is poplar. Poplar is not a very dense wood. So it's going to actually sound more warmer. It's going to be warmer sounding and not as bright. Maple's more dense, cherry's more dense. It'll be a little bit brighter edge to it. So my personal preference is for maple. This one happens to be poplar, so it's going to sound a little bit different, a little bit more fat. But yeah. And then just tweak it around, play around till you get it to your liking.